Okay, so we talked about critical thinking, what it means to be a good critical thinker, kind of how to critically think and engage with a text in a critical way, right? Well, the basis of philosophy specifically, and in this class that we're going to look at for the entire time we're together, are arguments. And arguments have a particular form, and they have particular properties, which I'm now going to introduce to you. All arguments consist of what we would call statements that are either true or false. And these statements are offered in support of a conclusion. Okay? Statements are different from things like commands or confessions or explanations. Okay? Although an explanation may contain statements. Could someone give me an example of a statement? A sentence that can be true or false? Steph Curry's the greatest. Yeah. Yes, can this be true or false? It can be true or false, right? Steph Curry's the GOAT. Awesome. Okay, how about another one?
It's day right now.
Say that again?
It's day right now.
It's day right now. That's a statement. How about another one? Diet Coke is the best drink ever. Here, we'll say Diet Coke is the GOAT of drinks. How about that? Yeah, all of these are statements. Okay? Because they can be true or false. But there are a lot of sentences that we might use in speech or writing that can't be true or false. Ah! That's a complete sentence, right? If you saw that in a book. Joe walked in through the door. Harold screamed, "Ah!" Right? That's a complete sentence. But can this be true or false? No, right? This isn't saying anything about anything. We might call this, I don't know, an exclamation. Not a statement. Go fetch me that water bucket. Can that be true or false? No, it's not a statement, it's a command. How about a confession? That's kind of statement-like, right? Oh, I'm just so in love with her. Right? Yeah, okay, that's statement-like. Explanations might contain statements. What are explanations? Well, it's like a description about how something works or happens, right? But these things, like commands, confessions, exclamations, explanations, they're distinct from what we might call arguments. Arguments are composed of a series of statements that can be true or false. These are what we call premises in support of a conclusion. For example, let's use the famous stock philosophy argument. All men are mortal, as in human beings. 2, Socrates is a man. So what's the conclusion? Socrates is mortal. Good. You see, this argument has 2 premises in support of one conclusion. numbering arguments like this, with the premises coming first and then the conclusion at the end, this is what we call standard form, or standardizing an argument. Now, if you're lucky, when you encounter arguments out there in the world, they'll be standardized like this for you, so you can easily see what the premises are and what the conclusion is. But that's not usually how it works. Okay? People, for example, when they're having a conversation with you, they're not going to tell you what the premises are, right, and number them for you, right? They'll just be, I don't know, word vomiting at you all these reasons why you should believe this thing, right? But it's helpful to put it in a form like this, because then we can see clearly, okay, what are the premises here? What are they trying to support? What exactly is the conclusion? Do the premises support the conclusion? Well, unsurprisingly, people have done a lot of thinking about this, a lot of categorizing, and we can classify premises into different categories. Okay? There are many different types of premises and conclusions. For example, one type of premise is empirical. If I gave you an empirical premise, what do you think that would be like? What does empirical mean? Example? Not quite. Yeah? Not exactly. Think about the sciences. We call them the empirical sciences, right? Things like material science and physics and biology and chemistry.
I suppose it would be something that's, can be pretty fixed or kind of mathematically proven.
That would be nice. Let's save that kind of property, though, for a different kind of premise.
Is it something in its simplest form?
It is pretty simple. When you see this word empirical, what you should think are the senses or observation. We call things like chemistry and biology the empirical sciences because they proceed on observation of the natural world. And we record those observations, and we devise experiments based on those observations. Well, empirical premises are just that. Premises based on observation of the world. We use our senses to observe the world. Our eyes, our nose, our ears, our mouth, our sense of touch. If you offer a premise based on one of these things, you're offering an empirical premise. So, for example, it looks like it's raining. If you saw this in an argument, you'd say, okay, I have an empirical premise here. There's a premise based on somebody's observation about something. I smell Pop-Tarts. If you saw that in an argument, that would be another example of an empirical premise. But there are other kinds of premises too, such as categorical, such as definitional. If an empirical premise is a premise based on observation, what do you think a definitional premise is? We might call it factual, yeah. What word do you see in here? Definition, right? A definitional premise is a premise based on how a word is used or what a word means. Pretty simple, right? What the definition of a word is. So, for instance, we'll use another famous philosophy stock example. A bachelor is an unmarried man. That is the definition of a bachelor if you look it up in the dictionary. A bachelor is an unmarried man. Or how about another example? A triangle has 3 sides. That's part of the definition of triangle, right? It has to have 3 sides. It's necessary. If it doesn't have 3 sides, right, it's not a triangle. That's part of what we mean when we use the word triangles. We're like, yeah, the shape with 3 sides that encloses an area with an internal angle of 180 degrees, right? The third one that we're going to look at in this class is testimonial. You can have testimonial premises. This one is kind of related to empirical. What do you think a testimonial premise is going to be like?
A statement from somebody that saw something happen or that witnessed it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a premise based on someone's report of something. So, can you give me an example? Yeah, sure. Yeah, put it in like statement form. John said the car was red that crashed into him. Right? The news said it was raining. Professor Gunner said blah, blah, blah. You're reporting something, right? You're giving a statement, something that can be true or false, couched in a report. Now, it's not critical exactly for you to be able to determine what kinds of premises are being used in an argument. But it is helpful. It can definitely be useful to you. The big one that we're going to focus on today are testimonial premises for the time being. Because these kind of premises in arguments show up a lot today, right? Think about conversations you have with other people. For example, about politics or legal policy or economic policy. Well, the news said the tariffs would be bad for us, right? You hear statements like this all the time in your conversations with other people. Or, well, the president said this and this, or so-and-so said that wasn't a good idea, right? When you encounter testimonial premises, there are going to be things you want to check for. First, is the premise plausible? Does it seem plausible on its face? For example, if I said, yeah, it's raining right now. Is that plausible on its face here in Florida in the summer? Yeah, right? It rains here. Now, if you and I were doing scientific work up in the Arctic Circle, and you're hanging out inside where it's warm, and I come from outside, and I'm like, you won't believe this, it's raining out there. Is that plausible on its face? Why not?
For the temperature.
Right. It wouldn't be raining. What would it be doing, if anything? It's snowing, right? Yeah. So you're going to check generally for plausibility. Is the premise plausible on its face? Secondly, you're going to want to check for reliability. Does the premise and the person giving you the premise, do they seem reliable? Do they seem like a reliable person? For example, I give you the following statement. Philosophy majors tend to score much better than most other majors on all standardized tests. Do you think that's reliable, what I just told you? I'm a professor, I'm a philosophy major who has their BA and their MA in philosophy with honors.
Bias.
There might be some bias. Yeah, that's true. On its face, do I seem reliable, though?
Yeah.
Does it seem like I want to trick you? Or give you bad info? I don't want to trick you. No, philosophy majors tend to do very well on standardized tests. But you're going to want to check premises generally for those two things. Is it plausible, the premise? Is the person saying it reliable? Do they seem like a trustworthy source? For instance, a Pfizer rep comes up to you and says, you should try our new medication, it's going to change your life. Do you think they're reliable about the safety and efficacy of their medication?
I don't think so.
Well, why not? Oh, there you go, right? You might think, oh, maybe they have a vested interest in me purchasing their medication, right? So maybe that might be something that would enter your mind. Where this gets a little bit more complicated is when we look at the testimony of experts. This is something we will also want to interrogate. Just because an expert says something, does that mean it's true? Yes or no? I'm a professional philosopher. I would consider myself an expert in philosophy, relatively speaking, at least to y'all. But that doesn't mean every word out of my mouth is true, right? I make mistakes. I'm a human being, right? Well, you're also going to want to check the testimony of experts to see if what they're saying is plausible on its face, and to see if, in general, they're reliable, if they can be trusted, if their information can be trusted. But you're also going to want to check for appropriate credentials. Now, I am a philosopher. Would you trust what I have to say? about, well, the efficacy of the new vaccine. Do I know what I'm talking about when it comes to that?
No.
Probably not, right? I didn't get any training in that. So is the expert talking about something within their domain of expertise or not? That's something you'll want to consider. You'll also want to consider whether or not they have stake in what they're telling you. Do they have any bias? For the same reason that you might not trust, for example, a Pfizer rep trying to sell you medicine, out there in the park, do you think they might be biased in any particular way towards their product? Perhaps so, right? This is related to 3, which has more to do with education and training, but I'm just writing it down to be thorough. Yeah, are they talking in their area of expertise or not? You can probably trust what I have to say if I'm telling you about Plato or Heidegger or John Locke or René Descartes. But when it comes to things like, meteorology, I'm telling you all these things about the weather, you should probably think, does Professor Gunner really have expertise in meteorology? Related to bias, finally, you'll also want to consider whether the expert testimony you are analyzing, whether there's a conflict of interest there. Are there any reasons why the person is telling you what they're telling you? Do they have a vested interest in you accepting what they're telling you, say? Whether that's to make money or cultivate more power for themselves, so on and so forth, right? For the same reason, again, to bring up that example, that you might not trust a Pfizer rep trying to sell you their famous new pill out on the lawn, you might think, well, yeah, they're making money off of this. Of course they want me to buy it off of them. Of course they're going to say all these nice things about it, right? You'll want to think, is the person just presenting the information, or do they have a vested interest or a conflict of interest in me doing something with that information? Accepting it, acting on it, etc. These are all things that you're going to want to consider when you evaluate the testimony of someone. Okay? This is part of what it means to be a good critical thinker. And all of these considerations should play into your analysis of arguments, especially if premises in those arguments are based on somebody's testimony or an expert's testimony. So, all of that stuff kind of is related to premises in an argument. Considerations you're going to want to, think about and turn over when you're evaluating premises. When it comes to conclusions, you're going to want to pay attention to how strong is the conclusion? How big of a claim is this argument making here? Okay? You're going to want to pay attention to how well supported the conclusion is. Because if you have an argument, say, with, one premise and one conclusion, you might think, well, that might not be as strong as the same argument with 10 premises that are supporting the conclusion. Right? So how well supported is the conclusion? And to put it in a word, the scope of the conclusion. How big is that conclusion they're driving at? How much does it cover? Okay? For example, let's take the following argument. It looks like it's raining in Tampa. So, the ground is wet in Tampa. That seems plausible enough, right? The ground is probably wet somewhere, right? That's a pretty general claim. I'm sure we could find somewhere that the ground is wet in Tampa where it's rained. That kind of conclusion has a very different scope from it looks like it's raining at 1280 East 113th Avenue, apartment 101 in Tampa. So, the ground is wet at that address in Tampa. You see how these conclusions have different scopes, and they're more or less plausible given, how big, how precise, how specific the conclusion is? Does that make sense? You intuitively kind of grasp what I'm talking about? This is not my address, by the way. I would never give you all my address. So, when you encounter arguments in the text, think about these things, especially if they're based on an expert's testimony, or when you encounter something on the news or in social media. Can the expert be trusted? Are they talking about what they've been trained in? Are they talking about in their area of expertise? Could there be a bias or conflict of interest there? So on and so forth, including me. Do I have a vested interest in getting you to think or behave in a certain way? Perhaps. So, that's something you should be considering when you're listening to what I tell you, and whether or not you accept my arguments and my claims. Okay, we're going to speed through the rest of this. Other properties of arguments. Generally speaking, arguments can utilize two different types of reasoning. Do you all know what these two types are? Shout them out if you do. Perfect. Inductive and deductive. I know my handwriting is not that great, but suffer through it. If you're employing deductive reasoning in an argument, what that means is if the premises are true, the conclusion is going to be true. It just flows from the premises. Okay? The conclusion logically follows from the premises. For example, let's take the following argument. All wars are started by miscalculation. I'm just going to abbreviate that. The Iraq conflict was a war. So, what follows logically from these two premises? Yeah. The Iraq conflict was started by a miscalculation. This argument utilizes deductive reasoning. You can see quite clearly that if these two premises are true, the conclusion naturally follows, right? This is a little bit different than inductive reasoning. When it comes to inductive reasoning, the conclusion doesn't logically follow from the premises. It's merely supported by the premises. Okay? Man, I'm writing so much, I'm starting to get high from this marker or something. For example, the sun has always risen every morning so far, so the sun will rise again tomorrow. Is it true that the sun has risen every morning so far? Is it definitely for sure, guaranteed, going to rise tomorrow? Aliens could come in out of nowhere and blow up our sun, right? That's a possibility, right? Or maybe, I don't know, a bunch of countries decide they're going to nuke the sun for no reason. And then it doesn't rise tomorrow because we blew it up. Premise 1 supports the conclusion, but the conclusion doesn't logically follow from the premise. It could be the case that the sun isn't going to rise tomorrow for some reason, even though it has every morning so far. Or take the following argument. Every swan I've seen has been white, so all swans are white. Right. My conclusion is supported by my experience. I've only ever seen white swans. But, as you probably know, there are things called black swans, right? So my conclusion was supported by my premise, based on my experiences, but the conclusion doesn't logically follow from the fact that I've only seen white swans. Does that make sense? You'll probably mostly encounter this, which makes it become a little tricky because there's more work you have to do. Okay, so we have the two different types of reasoning down. Let's now talk about validity. This is another property of arguments. Arguments can employ deductive and or inductive reasoning, and arguments fall into different categories, such as valid or invalid, weak or strong. Deductive arguments can either be valid or invalid. To say a deductive argument is valid is to say that the premises are true, and therefore the conclusion has to be true. This is a conditional. If the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. So we'll take out the argument we did earlier. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. So he's mortal. This is what we would call a valid deductive argument. Because if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. As it turns out, premise 1 is true, and premise 2 is true, and the conclusion is true. But we can have what are called invalid deductive arguments. And there are many more of these than the valid ones. Because invalid arguments can come in a lot of different forms. The premises may be true or false, and the conclusion may be true or false. There's no necessary relationship between the premises and the conclusion. And if you aren't getting all this down, don't worry. I'm going to upload all this to the Canvas page. So, for example, here's an example of an invalid argument. If it rains, the ground gets wet. The ground is wet, so it rained. If it rains, the ground is wet. Okay, seems true enough, right? The ground might even be wet. But even if both of these premises are true, does that mean the conclusion has to be true? No, it could have gotten wet some other way, right? Maybe I just poured a bucket out there to fool you. So this is what we would call an invalid argument. Here, premises are true. The conclusion doesn't have to be true. Or, for example, take this argument. If you are a penguin, you're black and white. You are not a penguin. Therefore, you are not black and white. Also invalid. Even if the first two premises are true, if you are not a penguin, you are black and white, true. You are not a penguin, true. Therefore, you are not black and white. That could be false, right? You don't have to be a penguin to be black and white. So, to sum up some of this, if you have a valid argument, if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. But if you have an invalid argument, it doesn't matter what's going on in the premises, the conclusion may be true or false. Okay? Valid arguments can have a false conclusion if their premises are false. Invalid arguments can basically be a multitude of different things. Invalid arguments can have true premises and a false conclusion, or false premises and a true conclusion, or true premises and a true conclusion. But there's one more determination that we make also when we're looking at arguments. And that is whether or not arguments are sound, or whether or not, because they're inductive, they're strong or weak. Validity is a property of deductive arguments. So only deductive arguments can be valid or invalid. If it turns out that we have a deductive argument, then we call that deductive argument sound if its premises are true. Sound arguments are arguments that are valid and true. Their premises are true and their conclusion is true. Consequently, we call an argument unsound if it is either invalid and or has false premises. Soundness applies to deductive arguments. Only deductive arguments can be sound. When we're thinking about inductive arguments, those aren't valid or invalid. Rather, we call them either strong or weak. Here, I'll write it here again. This is deductive. For inductive arguments, we call them strong or weak based on, well, how strongly their conclusion is supported by their premises. Of course, we also want all of our arguments to be consistent. What does it mean to say statements are consistent? Okay, anybody else?
They don't contradict each other.
Right. We want consistency in our arguments, which means all of the statements can be true at the same time. For example, if I gave you an argument that included the premise, it's raining, and then you're going down my argument and you get to premise 7 and it says it's not raining, you'd be like, that's inconsistent. You're contradicting yourself, right? So we want to construct arguments that at least have consistent premises and a conclusion which is consistent with the premises. If one or more of the statements conflict in some way, if they contradict one another, we call them inconsistent. Okay, questions? I know I dumped a lot of information on you, but I will be uploading all this to Canvas so you can always look at it later. Class isn't done yet, hold on. Questions? Okay, I'm going to give you some homework. Have this completed by Monday. You'll turn it in on Monday. Take one on your way out. I'm going to ask you to read some passages, and I want you to standardize the arguments in those passages. 1, 2, 3, 4, ending with your conclusion. All right? Okay, where should I place them? Going out that way or this way? Guess we'll go half and half. I don't know. I'll place them here. Grab one on your way out. Turn it in on Monday. We do not have class on Friday, okay?
Thank you.
Yeah, here, take one. Here's your homework.
Is that really more to it too?
Yeah.